So this was created in response to the kind of overwhelming show up of black squares on Instagram as a response to systemic racism. And so, yeah, the idea that this is more than a black square is the idea that we need to be doing more than posting black squares online to kind of show our support and show the work that we want to do in combating anti-racism. And so the two kind of first questions I want you to think about today is why you're here, and how do you feel? And so also again, how did I feel 1 year ago? So I actually added that one in, knowing that we're a year ago. So you can either kind of lean into your feelings where you are now, or lean into where you were a year ago, or maybe have a little bit of a flashback and look at the two. So yeah, I guess I'll put the three of you in a breakout group and you can have some discussions. And then I'll see you back in here. Was that enough time to speak? If you also like you had time to speak.
Uh, well, I didn't get to my feelings. But everyone else, we
Okay.
got through quite a bit.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to share, or are we keeping that for the room? Also, 100%.
I thought our discussions were really good. And I mean, we probably spoke more about why we're here. Um, and my reasons for being here is that, uh, I mean, especially over the last 12 months, I've been confronted by, not just hypothetically my role in perpetuating racism, but just like getting called out for stuff that I've done and been involved in that has really hurt people and harmed people. And it's made it really obvious to me, like the limits, like just the limits of my understanding of this issue, and what people are actually going through. And I didn't talk about my feelings, but for me, when you said, Casey, like, would we want to record what we're discussing, uh, or go to a breakout room? I actually was like really afraid, um, and I didn't. I was like, I was pretty happy when we decided to go to breakout rooms, because I think for me, there'll still be. I don't want to be seen as this person that's part of the problem here, but I kind of I've now been confronted by that fact that I have to understand my part in it, and that's going to feel really uncomfortable and painful, and I'll have to deal with like the limits of what I can do and all sorts of other things. So I was feeling quite afraid in those discussions, and it also brought up quite a bit of um, the pain of hearing what other people have gone through and how much struggle they've gone through, and then my pain at playing a part in that as well started to come up.
Great. Well, thank you so much for lots and lots of honesty and vulnerability there. I think that that's really, really key and really going to be very useful for anyone who does come and watch this back, to see that there is, there is a possibility to speak openly about these things and recognize your place in that. So thank you, Dan, for your honesty there. And thanks everyone for the conversations that you had, which I'm sure were great. So moving on, quick content warning, which is for kind of all Black and POC participants. There's going to be discussions of racism, anti-Blackness. There will be use of racist images and discussions of enslavement. And so this content warning is just so you're aware of what's coming and you're able to kind of check out at any point, and just kind of, again, for the recording, just to know that this is going to be coming up. So just to manage your kind of self-care in the space that you need, in approaching this topic. I think I'll also say as well that this session is primarily created for non-Black and non-POC people. Fundamentally, that's kind of the audience I had in mind. And I think that it's very important to kind of state that, because there are different needs that need to be met in these sessions. And so this is fundamentally one that I'm not specifically talking to Black folk or POC folk. And so I don't think that there is a need for them to be there for this type of session. However, you are welcome to participate if you are still watching. So yes, moving on to that. Outcomes of today, really, really quickly. Some shifting of focus, just kind of thinking about where our kind of positions are when we look at different things and situations. Some self-reflection, which is probably the biggest no-brainer. Some information and some education. That's kind of going to be one of the purposes of us being here today as well. To understand the importance of positionality, which simply put just means understanding your identity and where you are in the world and what impact it has on you and others around you. And then also, again, the big outcome was also we're going to learn to communicate, hopefully in new and more beneficial and productive ways. Quick theory of change as well. This is something that I kind of like to outline at the beginning of these types of sessions. So thinking about where you might be on your theory of change, idea that hopefully you're here to make some sort of commitment to change, be that personally, professionally, both. Who knows? But yeah, the one that people maybe don't get is pre-contemplation, which is kind of the point of like thinking about it. So you probably know you should be thinking about it, but you're like, nah, I got time for that today. That's what pre-contemplation is. And so you'll be at a different point when you come into this session. Hopefully you will have moved a step after, but that's also quite a big ask after a 2 hour session. So not to kind of feel pressure there, but always kind of good for you to map your own journey about where you feel that you're going to be. Often people kind of, which is what we saw with Black Square Summer, with the contemplation and then heading straight to action, and the dangers that can kind of come out from that, of something you've really not addressed before, but then thinking you have all of the tools and the knowledge to go in and decide how to fix it. So yes, that's just a quick mention of that there. I want to share this quote. So obviously with the work that I do, I'm obviously always leaning on the work of other Black women too. And so I want to reference them when I'm doing that. And so this quote, I think, came again, this was sort of said at the beginning of last year when all of this kind of started happening. When I say all of this, the world stage, looking at systemic racism. And so I will read it to you. The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself, and that's the only way forward. I think this pretty much sums up so much of what needs to be understood and done. The idea that we're free of all of this, which we'll go into in much more detail in the session. And I think often as well, this can help to kind of bring that initial defensive barrier down that I know a lot of people have. The kind of idea that I could be racist or you could be racist is this kind of awful allegation, as opposed to an entry point to really start to think and to reflect on why these conversations are so important. But yes, we will come back to this, but I wanted to sort of tone set this session as we get started. So back to another question, which we'll put you back in the breakout rooms for. So what is the purpose of race? I'm going to give you like 2 minutes. It shouldn't be that hard. Okay, who has some answers for me? What is the purpose of race?
Okay, we discussed different purposes. Initially, race is just a tool for exploitation or for dividing different classes of humans. But it has been redefined as well, and it can and race has been a huge part of an identity and sense of community, and a form of empowerment sometimes. So it has both like readings of race. Like for some people, that can be really they have that sense of identity and power that comes from being who they are. But initially, it has been, and it's still being used as a way of oppressing.
Super. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you for speaking for the group as well. So this is actually a one-word answer. So I always ask this question in this session, and if it's a big group, small group, whatever, people can come up with some pretty creative ways of answering it. Usually long drawn out explanations, usually sort of a long sentence, things like a way of discrimination, all kind of stuff that talks about historically how it was used and why and what happened. And quite simply, the answer is racism. Purpose of race is racism. And so again, when we're talking about the examples that Claudia gave, is in this is kind of used as a form of identity and for people to kind of empower themselves in terms of who they are. The only reason they're having to do that is because of racism. And so the idea that race as something that was created, it was a social function that was created. But if you look at it kind of outside of the reason why we're using it today, like socially, anthropologically, scientifically, it has no purpose whatsoever besides racism. So use a means to justify why people should be killed, exploited, marginalized, pushed out to the margins of anywhere where they may have been, forcibly removed. And so it's kind of very interesting to kind of see the ways in which people often respond to this and avoid the one word which sums it up perfectly. So yeah, I just kind of add this in because it's kind of a little bit of a, I wouldn't say fun conversation starter, because I'm not going to say racism is fun, but it's one to get our minds sort of ticking and thinking about the way that these conversations happen and thinking about language as well, which we'll also talk about later. So yes, thank you for your answers there. So moving on, does anyone recognize these chaps? And if you do, please tell me who they are. No, no one. So the guy you should at least know when I tell you his name on the right is Christopher Columbus. You know who he is? No, okay. And the other guy is Toussaint Louverture. So he was responsible essentially for the liberation of Santo Domingue and Haiti as we know it today. But he's very rarely talked about historically. We know all about Christopher Columbus and all of his adventures and all of his exploring that he did, but we rarely talk about him as the colonizer that he was. And so, if you don't know anything about Toussaint Louverture, he worked, well, not worked, but kind of worked on behalf of the Spanish against the French, and then the French and Spanish against Britain, then sort of for the internal kind of liberation of France. So, kind of was on everybody's sides back and forth. And then it was kind of like, actually, I'm just going to do this for me, for my people. And so, somebody who quite literally is responsible for freeing of his own people is seldom known to most people sort of in Europe, across the world, in the Americas, but somebody that is probably one of the world's worst colonizers is known and celebrated and is in statues across Europe, streets, museums, I don't know, everything's named after this guy. So just kind of thinking about the roles of those two men in history and thinking about why we know more about one than the other. And this is what I want to get to the point of kind of shifting perspectives. Like, what conclusions can we start to draw when we think about things in this context, like from this perspective? If we think about why Christopher Columbus is so prominent in our lives, in our history, when I say in our lives, I mean quite literally present in our lives, in the streets that we walk around, in the buildings that we know, in the history that we know. But what he did was absolutely atrocious and probably had one of the biggest, most catastrophic impacts on human history to date. But then we know so little about a man that did so much good for his own people. So just really thinking about that focus and shifting that perspective there, which I will get you to continue to do throughout the session. So yeah, on the topic of shifting focuses and thinking about different perspectives, I want to talk about Black history. So I'm thinking, like, in terms of when you hear Black history being mentioned, when it's talked about maybe in the media, even as you grew up going to school and maybe you talked about Black history, maybe you didn't even at all, but the times it may have been mentioned around you, it tends to go a little something like this. So this kind of big thing called slavery that happened, and then that wasn't so great and people got upset about that. Then we moved into this thing called Jim Crow, then segregation, then civil rights, then something called separate but equal, and then we're kind of at today where we could call it equality. I feel like that should be familiar as a form of Black history that we were known and taught in some ways, through schooling, through life, through what we're seeing around us today. And so I just want to really get you to think about why we call this Black history. Why is this Black history? So if we take some imagery to think about that. So this is an image you may or may have not seen. It's quite simply something I pulled from Google, of a kind of representation of some of the earlier stages, at least the first stage that I talked about of enslavement here. And you can see sort of two women with their children being auctioned off as enslaved people. And so realistically, if this is what we're going to call Black history, but then we think about who else is in that picture, who's active in that picture as well, who's doing the doing and who's having things done to them in that picture, then by that account, white history is therefore then being enslavers and those who wrote those Jim Crow laws and those who enforced segregation and the anti-civil rights protesters, and then coming up to today with the white supremacists. So if we talk about Black history like that, then this is how we talk about white history, right? Or wrong. So I'm going to go back to that image again. I'm going to take the two sort of non-active people out of the picture, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 7, 8 white men in that picture. But this image is an image that's used to talk about Black history. It's not used to talk about white history. And so I want you to think about why that is. So why are we using this image to talk about Black history? What would that do? Whose power would come into question? Who would have to take responsibility? Who would have to be accountable? And fundamentally, who would have to do the work? And so there are some of the questions that you can answer right now if you want to. If not, you can just sit and ponder them as I read them out. But when we talk about, white history, are we talking about that accountability and that responsibility, or are we talking about something else? What even is white history? White history to me, the Industrial Revolution, World War I, World War II, all kind of great celebrations of accomplishments, achievements, inventions, but rarely a critical look at what majority white people have been responsible for to different groups of peoples across the course of human history. Yeah, just some thoughts there. I don't know if anyone wants to say anything. You totally don't have
to. I'm from a country, I'm from Australia, and when you put up Columbus, I can very much relate to the celebration of colonial settlers, people who are responsible for bringing in genocide, as being the people who were celebrated as being like the founding people of the country, and just how difficult it is for many / most people in Australia to actually talk about the racism, talk about the things that were done to Indigenous Australians, the things that keep on being done to Indigenous Australians, to people of colour in the country, and just like needing to establish like that idea of it's just exploration, it's adventure, it's settling a place, it's achievement. This brought progress to the world, and not being willing to look at the other side of stuff, which, the core of it, which is destruction and taking things away. And my experience of coming to Europe has been an even bigger need to distance, for white people to need to distance themselves from those discussions of what Europeans did in all sorts of different parts of the world and continue to do. In the UK, for instance, if I've had many British people, white British people, make fun of me as an Australian for our racist history, and I'm sitting there and I'm like, it was literally our joint ancestors who did this, right? Like it's, I just find that like even more the case as much or in a different way the case in Europe, of not being able to see the European role in things that might have happened in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I completely agree. When I grew up, I'm from Spain, so the colonization of South America was like a big topic throughout school, then high school, and then we would read books that would tell the story in an awful way. And it's always this shifting of responsibility and the shifting on asking the hard questions. We would never ask the children if they think this is good, but it's always like we tell the story, so we never have to look at ourselves, and we never have to feel any kind of responsibility or take responsibility. And that translates into right now, you don't think about the things that you're doing day to day. Because if people who did horrible things, they just were explorers, why are we going to do anything? Because we are good people, right? Like, it's all gone. It's not important. Like that happened so long ago, and they weren't that bad. It was another time. It was always what it's the feeling, the general feeling of the room whenever this topic comes up, and it's the lack of responsibility and the lack of telling the story as from all the different perspectives. It's always the story of from one single perspective, which is very convenient. And it's very convenient, so we never shift the narrative. And when you make the passive of the receivers or something, or of for example, the image that you just showed, when you're saying that is not your story, that is victim blaming as well. You're saying that whatever happened to these people, it just happened to these people. It's something that happened. You're not taking any responsibility, or you're not telling the story as it is, and you're not even being historically accurate either.
Yeah. Like it's quite literally just like just a lie, really.
Yeah.
Just a lie. I think, yeah, and the point you say about it being convenient, but it's also very comfortable as well.
Yes.
It's very comfortable to think that your ancestors or your lineage and the legacy that you live and benefit from today just came from people hundreds of thousands of years ago, and that's none of my business, and I don't need to get involved, and things just are the way they are and very calculated. I remember a few years ago actually doing I wasn't a session I was leading, and there was a session I was part of, and there was a young white guy in it, and he was like, oh, I just don't think that they meant to like be that bad. Like, I think that like maybe they didn't realize what they were doing, like the times were different. And everyone in the room sort of was like, oh. And there's like, said to this guy who was, I think he was like an Oxbridge kid, that like there's quite literally accounts, like diary entries of the brutalization of Black and brown folk and the enjoyment that was taken from it. And knowing what they were doing because they had completely dehumanized them and decided that was what they were owed and due. And his face was just complete and utter shock. Like, oh, I didn't know that. And I think that's the point where like it started clicking for me of being like, wow, this really is like the truth that people think they're being told. This history has been told in a way that it makes it seem like it's a fact, as opposed to an interpretation or somebody's perspective of what they want it to be for their own gain that has lasted 400 years. Yes, but thank you, Claudia and Dan. So we're going to talk about language. And so this is actually, well, this little square here is taken from a friend of mine, Liz Kleinrock. I highly recommend that you follow her on Instagram if you don't already. Her page is Teach and Transform. She does really great anti-oppression and anti-bias work. She's just released a book. And so, yes, she talks a lot about language and why language is so important. And so the example she gives here is, again, the way we used to talk about enslavement and the use of certain terms in that. So for example here, the idea that slaves, like that's kind of a very like, passive word, as if they were just these bunch of slaves just hanging around in Africa and then taken to fulfill their destiny, as opposed to enslaved people. And so when we talk about enslaved people, we have to shift the focus. We have to shift the perspective to think about who was enslaving them. The idea that they were people, they were fathers, mothers, children, aunts, uncles, doctors, scientists, farmers, all of these, they had roles and lives as opposed to just being these kind of empty vessels that were there and then taken and taken to different places. So I think that's a really important thing that I really want to kind of shift on. And so there's a list of words here that I have. And so you got slaves as the first one we regularly use. Actually hostages, slave owners, again, like slave owner, like the ownership of something comes with very positive positive connotations. Where in fact they were human traffickers. And slave catchers, again, that's controversial point. The police, that's how the police was formed. Again, Liz has a great explanation of that on her page. You can look at the historical legacy of the police and how that came from, enslavement. Plantations, again, I always feel uncomfortable with that word, but quite literally they were death camps. Mistresses or concubines, I think another word is used as well. In fact, these are rape victims. Discipline, another word that's often used regularly when we talk about enslavement history. That's just torture and murder. The overseers, again, on the plantation were torturers. Again, kind of like trading, which, the slave trade, again, some sort of very positive business-like. We're just talking about kidnapping people. And so there's a really good extract, which kind of, I say good, it's a very like representative of the point that I'm trying to make here, and how language has such an impact on the way that we think about things. And so we're talking about this perspective and the way in which we're told this certain history. When it's told using certain language, it makes you think of something else. So this is just a sentence. So the prominent slave owner never publicly recognized the offspring of he and one of his slave romancers, but allowed him to serve in the house. And so if we take that language and then we shift the perspective on it and we tell it with some truth, the rich human trafficker raped his female hostage and then held their son hostage as well on the death camp that he owned. We don't hear the story of enslavement talked about like that. And think about how that would change so much about what we know about our own history and our collective history if we were to tell historical accounts with accuracy. So yeah, just a really important point about language, which again, we'll talk about in a much more kind of contemporary sense later on. So yes, I want you to talk about it as well though. So why is language important when we're thinking about shifting perspectives and becoming anti-racist? Do you want to do like a 2-minute breakout room? Hey, how was that?
Good.
So I will try to relay the conversation because I think I talk the most.
Great.
And what we were discussing, so we were using your examples, your historical examples a lot, and just reflecting on how both, especially for white people, we perceive the history we write as something very neutral, something objective, something we just describe what's happening. And when we do not pay attention to that and the language and the words that we use, then we get this idea that we're just describing. There's nothing, like we're not reflecting on who is describing, and it's important because it forces us to reflect on who is describing what do we mean by objectivity and neutrality, how is that captured in the words we're using, and what are we not paying attention to when we use certain words, what sort of what areas are we not seeing, but people identity, so on, are we not seeing when we are thinking that we just describe things in a neutral way.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, I use the example that we use when we work with gender in my organization, at least, and that is sort of the same thing that you say, you know, Lisa was raped. We don't say Lisa was raped by someone, or we don't put the perpetrator into the equation. So by using language in a certain way, we only focus on one aspect of what happened, that is, and who it happened to, instead of where the problem really lies, that is the perpetrator who actually did it. And I guess you could say that it's some of the same thing that happens in these discourses, that we remove responsibility and we remove the self-reflection about who actually did what in what situation against who.
Yeah, 100%. I think you summed it up perfectly. And I really like the idea of this kind of history being told as from a position of neutrality or a position of objectivity. I had a professor at university once who was like, objectivity doesn't exist, because if someone's telling a story, then it's coming from a person. And so it's consistently subjective. It's always a subjective story, a subjective point of view, a subjective opinion. And so that was like a light bulb moment for me, again, because you look back at the people who told, you know, these stories and historical tellers, the idea that they're just objectively standing back and watching everything going on and just describing it, as opposed to actually having a position, like thinking about our positionality, who we are. Identity has an impact not only on the way that we see the world, but the way that we experience it and understand it. And to understand that when we are talking about these things, our positionality is so key, and it is going to have an impact on what we understand, but also what we tell. I think that's really a great stepping stone in terms of really understanding anti-racism work as well. So yes, thank you for that discussion, and thank you for sharing. So this is the absolute love of my life, probably the only man I'll ever love with my whole heart, Mr. James Baldwin. If you don't know him, he's mine, but go ahead and check him out. So he has one of many thousands of quotes is, really thinking about where we're situating this. So when we're doing this work, obviously we know we kind of come from organizations that focus on gender and gender inequality, gender stereotypes, the impacts of those. But kind of when we're expanding this out and we are being intersectional and we're not kind of being one-dimensional with our work, we kind of get stuck in the paradox, because as James said, the paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious, one begins to examine the society in which he's being educated. So whatever you're talking about, which whoever's identity is kind of under question at the moment, you start to question quite literally everything around you. And I think, again, that brings in and sort of summarizes really well that idea of neutrality and that idea of being objective. Who is telling me this? Why are they telling me that? Why was I taught it in that way? And so when you start to think about anti-racism work, you have to question a lot of the spaces that you've been in and a lot of the people that have taught you before that. And that can be quite a difficult process. And this is also why I say as well, this session is really geared towards, non-racialized folk, or like people who are racialized as white, because the idea is that there is a real reality here for lots of white folk when they start to examine the spaces that they're in and examine the ways in which they've been educated. And there's a bit of an internal crisis that goes on, because like I said, racism sucks for everybody, okay? Like the idea that it's been a break for you isn't true, because when you see, like, look today, look how many people showed up. It's not an easy space for people to lean into. And that doesn't mean that that's right or that people need to be particularly pitied, but there needs to be an acknowledgement of it. Because if we're not going to solve this problem, we need to name it and we need to be aware of what we're facing. So yeah, that's why I included this quote here, because I think that that's very pertinent for certain folks who approach anti-racism work, particularly in this case, white folk. So we're going to talk about statistics and intellectualizing racism. So as I kind of usually say as a bit of a spiel, this presentation workshop could have been really easy to put together if I used a bunch of stats, this percentage of people have experienced racism, this percentage of people have had this happen to them. I purposefully don't use statistics in the work that I do. If anyone, probably Claudia and Dan, who do know me more personally, know that I'm like maybe not a big numbers person. Maybe you don't know that. Who knows? Anyway, I don't use numbers because quite literally, I think that they can be manipulated to be used in any way that you want. Again, if you look in the small print with a lot of stats, you'll find that there isn't really much going on there. You can say 85% of people in the UK think that racism is an abomination. And then you read the small print and it says this study was done on 45 people aged 18 to 24. Well, then that really ain't telling you much. So the ways in which they can kind of be manipulated and used to reach certain goals is always a worrisome moment for me. It's not to say that I discourage the use of them. I personally don't use them, and I just ask people to be vigilant when they do or when they're reading them. Also for the fact that we've had statistics for like 400 to 500 years, and we're still where we are now. So if numbers were so useful, we'd surely be in a better place than we are now. And I think often as well, numbers can be used to gaslight people. So the ways in which people often have to prove what they're saying, have to back up their claims, back up their feelings with data, with academia, with evidence. And so I don't like the ways in which that often people can say, well, how do you know that? Like, well, how many people, like if we say racism is still an issue for people today, well, not many, but well, one is already enough, and so these are the reasons why I feel this way about it. That isn't to say that you should feel about it, but it's just to kind of have that reflexivity when you're looking at numbers, when you're presented with them. And yes, which leads me on to intellectualizing racism, which is a bit of a mouthful. And so obviously, as I'm pretty sure like we said, this was a whole year ago since George Floyd was murdered. And since then, there has been an absolutely enormous, giant uptake from the publishing industry in the Western world, let's say, to publish books about racism, about the racialized experience, about white supremacy, about all of these things. But fundamentally, all of those books that came out, I can maybe list 5 to 10 just off the top of my head. Who all of those books written for? Like, why I'm no longer talking to white people about race, me and white supremacy, like all of these books, who were they written for? They were written for white people. So in a moment when we're finally talking about racism, wow, people are really still experiencing this. Okay, so let's produce loads of content and help and support for white folks, the people who aren't at the center of this. And I think that that's a really, really important thing to understand. This is not to discourage or to say, do not go out and read, do not read books. They're very important, they're very helpful. But like, think about the ethics of that too. The idea is that there has been no resources for Black and brown folk to deal with systemic racism, to understand the trauma and the psychological impact of racism and living underneath it, to understand what it means to be gaslit every single day of your life. Those resources haven't been invented. Actually, I do know of one that's going to be released in like a month. But other than that, the idea that these have all been created. And so again, think of it as the idea that these books, again, on average cost between like maybe 10 and 20 pounds, euros, dollars. The idea that the time it takes to read a book, the money it costs to get that, that's also a huge privilege. That's also a privilege that lots of people don't have. Thinking about that space as well. Thinking about what does it mean to be a Black person or a person of color, to see all of these books being written about your experience, but even you don't have the tools to articulate them and to understand them. And then you're therefore have to go out to pay to do it, to understand it, to get it, to defend yourself, to make people feel better about it. The amount of white women that asked me if I'd read Michelle Obama's book, I didn't even want to read the damn book at that point, because I was like, I don't want to talk to you about it. You know, this idea that the ways in which that we use books on racism and anti-racism even just as a way to center Black trauma almost as a spectacle. I think that's really important as well. So when we're talking about books or we're talking about statistics, think about the number of interviews on television that we've seen in the past year where people are asking Black people to talk about what's happened to them and how they feel and what they think their response is like. We're asking them to repeat trauma. You're watching violence happen right in front of you. To ask somebody to talk about the racism that they've experienced, that their family may have experienced live on TV or in an interview, is not a form of news. It's not education. It's trauma and it's an act of violence. And so I just want the whole purpose of bringing this into the conversation here is the awareness of that, because I still see it still happening today. Like, I know Tonya corrected me and said that, it was the 25th was the date that George Floyd was murdered. I didn't register it in my brain because the day, again, on the anniversary of it, it's just the same spectacle again, Black trauma as spectacle. The two news channels taking over, speaking to people, interviewing members of his family, people in the community, like the ways in which that even in the process of trying to make this better, we're still dehumanizing Black folk. Black folk aren't still being talked about. They're not being centered about their joy and their love and their life and the things that they achieve. They're being interviewed and the spotlight is on them about the trauma again. And so it's, again, to throw caution, to shift that perspective, to shift that focus and really think, when Black people are being centered, why are we centering them again? Why is this about them again? How many interviews have we seen with white folk explaining why they didn't care about racism before somebody was murdered on television? Why are we not speaking about white folk who suddenly, I've got all these books. Why are we not talking about that? They're not at the center. And I understand that it's difficult to center people when you're trying to decenter them. And I'm still working that out in my head as well. But yeah, this whole slide and my slightly large monologue is about that. I don't know if you have any comments. Go ahead if you do. Or I've just scared you all into silence with my knowledge. Yeah.
No, I just wanted to say that it's a lot of food for thought, and that's definitely something I'm going to be reflecting a lot on. That's just that.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Are we good? We're good. Tonya's smiling at me, so we're good. Okay, so we're going to move to the UK and EU context, which is obviously very important. We're doing this with Men Engage Europe, of course. So this is really centralizing who we're talking about and why we need to be engaged here. Tonya, as we know, is our absolute beautiful facilitator who's also here from the US, and so has already done a session which you can access online. We will be doing the third session together. And so again, as you'll see in her session, if you haven't watched it, please do go back and watch it before you do this. If you're already halfway through this and you haven't watched it, then you'll figure it out. Anyway, so just to say that I really want to bring this to an UK and EU context because these problems, our problems, are so readily and willingly exported to the US. It's America's problem, well, that's happening over there. In America, this is really bad. In America, these kind of things. So slavery and colonization. racism, police brutality, poverty, all of these things are America's problem, but the reality is that they're all very real British and European problems. And I think that's really important to talk about. And I think that that's something, again, I know that, like, Dan, you've mentioned it as well, talking about how there is this issue in Europe where people don't want to talk about their racism. And so I want to think about where else racism is showing up, and maybe kind of break it down into some different terms, which I know we've talked about language. We're going to go back to talking about language. So these are just a list of terms, words that you may or may not be familiar with. I'll give you a sec to look at them. Let me know if there's any that you don't understand or would like some extra clarification on, because I think that these are really important when we're talking about these issues.
Yeah, could you explain spiritual bypassing?
Yeah, spiritual bypassing is usually the one that people don't know the most. So it's like this idea of using spirituality, or what I call toxic positivity, to distract what somebody's saying, to silence what somebody's saying, to talk over what somebody's saying. And so it could be, for example, me talking about the impact of racism in my life today, and my colleague next to me is like, why do you keep bringing this up? Like, we just need to focus on the positives. Like, you're always so negative. Do you know what I mean? Like, things are so much better today. Or like the idea that you would say, basically anything that tries to throw a positive spin on it to make it seem like you're the one creating the problem. So this idea that, like, well, you're just being really divisive. Like, this is a time for us to be united. We need to stand together. You know, the types of like counter arguments that come in when you talk about this. And so you use like spirituality or positivity as a way to make it seem like that experience isn't happening, or that reality isn't real for certain groups of people, fundamentally because you want to distract the fact that responsibility is on you to talk about it and think about it. So yeah, it's often a tactic that people, I would say, unconsciously use. I think they consciously know that they're doing it, but I don't think they understand the depths of the violence at it, really, in terms of doing that. So the idea that me bringing up racism means I am the problem, as opposed to racism being the problem as well. Any more? Maybe knowledge violence. People don't usually get that one.
I was also gonna blackface in the broader sense. Yeah, is that also how you'd be using it here? So not just putting things on your face, not just putting black paint on your face, but also trying to present yourself as being like black friendly or black led or something like this, where you're actually not, or
okay, so the idea is like, so obviously blackface in the sense of quite literally like changing the color of your skin with makeup for entertainment purposes, which I will literally get to on the next slide. But then also this brings up the issue of digital blackface. So digital blackface, either using emojis that don't represent your skin tone, can be a form of digital blackface. It's usually the more exaggerated emojis as well that tend to be used as well when people are like, if people are using a fist, they'll use like quite literally a black power fist, as opposed to just using their own skin color. The use of GIFs, I still don't know the answer to that debate. Ways in which people will often use a GIF or GIF that is of a black person, usually again with an exaggerated reaction to something. Again, that's a form of digital blackface, which again seems like a very harmful thing, but it's very reminiscent of old minstrel shows and the ways in which the first kind of representations of black folk, which were white people with black paint on them, they were exaggerated movements, exaggerated things, again, falling into also those stereotypes of, you know, the sassy black woman and all these types of things too. So again, it seems very innocent for talking kind of intent and impact, those types of conversations, but the reality is that there is a kind of sinister history to it, which is why it's really important to consider and to think about. And then as Dan said, again, is on a representational level, even organizations and companies that use pictures of Black and brown folk or the marginalized folk to make it seem like they have an inclusive organization, make it seem like that they're welcoming and respectful of those people, but actually their internal board, their leadership staff do not represent those faces whatsoever. And so that can be a form, oh, hey, Rich. That can be a form of coercion, essentially, to make people feel like that they're in a safe space, but they're not. I'll just talk about knowledge violence really quickly. So academically, it's epistemological violence, but knowledge violence is easier to say. And so that's basically kind of the ways in which you use sort of knowledge, data, information to pathologize Black communities. as a means of justifying the treatment that they're being given in their society. And so, for example, an example of this would be like unemployed Black mothers with sons who are committing crimes, the ways in which that data that comes from certain spaces would be used to justify the fact that you can therefore treat those people differently or treat them very badly or violently because of the fact that as well, we're dehumanizing them, they're completely wrong, we're interpreting their experience as something that's outside or problematic, and so therefore anything bad that happens to them, that's just like, that's what happened, it's not my fault, you know. And I'm happily and willingly able to do that as well as an individual because of the mainstream ways in which those certain groups of people are represented to be other or different or wrong.
Okay, would you put cultural appropriation or exploitation under like blackface here, like, and the idea that if only you loved the people as much as you love the culture, or where would you put that?
I mean, I would probably give it its own heading, to be honest. I mean, there are some ways in which I guess you can talk about kind of a cultural appropriation as a form of blackface if we're talking about certain individuals and the way in which they use hairstyles and the way they will kind of use makeup, clothing, all those different things as well. But I do think it's kind of a more important topic and maybe should have its own subheading. So maybe I'll add that in from now on. But yes, thank you for adding that in. What have I missed here? Nothing. I'm going to move on. Racism. Why have I written that on the board? I do know the answer. I know it sounded like I was asking myself, but I do know. Why have I written racism here?
Maybe to recenter the problem.
Yeah, so essentially all of these words are really helpful and really useful because they can break down very individualized experiences, often invisibilized experiences, so like microaggressions and gaslighting, they're often things that don't get picked up. And so they can be really helpful in a personal way for you to understand what's happening to you, but also in a work context as well. If you could go to a manager or head of HR and be like, Stuart was gaslighting me, as opposed to he was just kind of being a bit weird and it made me uncomfortable with what he said. Language can be really powerful here in terms of really naming the experiences that are happening to us. But there's been this really, I say weird, but it's power hungry shift in the sense of using these words so that we don't have to say racism. All of these things are still racism. That's why that word's there. They're all still racism. So again, it's important to have the other understandings of what those words are and what they represent, but they are still references to racism. And I just want to bring that in because of the ways in which people use them so they don't have to say racism. We think back to that very first question.
Would you suggest, like, for example, just saying racism, if we use one of those terms, like just put racism straight after it as like a practice? Like blackface racism, or do you know what I mean? Like, as rather than just like leave it unsaid?
I guess I've never thought about the way that you would present it. Like, I mean, you could put it in brackets, but I think the idea is like, the reason why I'm underlining it here is more so there's a heightened awareness of when people use, oh, it's just, they were gaslighting. Like, it was thinking about microaggressions. If you're like, oh, you know, we want to address microaggressions in our organization. No, you want to address racism in your organization. You know, that's more the point I'm talking about in the sense. But I guess in that ways you could put it in brackets behind the use of blackface or gaslighting as that reminder that that's actually what we're talking about.
Yeah. Or say we want to address racism and we're focusing on working on microaggressions and being aware how that comes in.
Yeah.
I've got a noisy dog next to
me. Okay, Bailey's in agreement, so we'll move on. So blackface in the UK. I don't know if you recognize any of these things. I like to pop them in because I just think there is an enormous lack of awareness of the role that blackface has played in UK entertainment in recent years. And so, yeah. Do you know who these people are? I'm going to call on Richie because I know Claudia and Dan get a...
That's Bo Selector and meant to be Craig David on the top left.
Yeah, which is the Mr. Keith Lemon, who is very famous and very wealthy. And then in the middle, we've got the two, my least favorite people ever, Matt Lucas and David Williams. That's how much I dislike them. I don't remember their names. Who did a show called Little Britain, which was basically just sexism, fatphobia, transphobia, racism, packaged in what they called comedy. also two men with giant flashing careers. I think David Walliams has blocked me on Twitter because I keep asking him when he's going to apologize for it. But, there you go. Fight the fight, people. Then we've got Mr. Ant and Mr. Deck. Again, two very, very big, famous, wealthy white male presenters in the UK. I'm trying. Is that Harry Enfield? I always forget that one. Harry Enfield, League of Gentlemen. Again, these all happened in 2000 and after 2002 after, so very, very recent. And the reason I bring this in as well is the idea that when we're talking about responsibility and accountability, to my knowledge, none of these men have apologized for what they've done. None of these men have talked about the money that they made doing these shows and having this platform and being able to do them. As I said, David Walliams blocked me. And so I just really want to think about when we're talking about cancel culture and these types of things, and then you can't do anything anymore. These conversations you'll be hearing about, if you get something wrong, you're going to be cancelled. Not for white men. That does not happen. And I think that's a really important thing to take away. There are certain individuals who do make mistakes and lose their careers and are called upon in the right way and, reprimanded like they should be and are forced to apologize or do apologize if they're in accord. But I just want to draw reference to this because I just find it completely shocking. And I find that lots of times when I do this session, particularly in the UK, people have conveniently don't even remember that this was really happening, or then see it and think, oh, wow, and maybe don't reflect on it. So that's why I've brought that one in.
I just say, Case, with this one, it that idea of forgetting is seemingly everything here, because after Black Lives Matter last summer, a lot of shows with blackface in those episodes were removed off streaming channels, and that was considered all that was needed in response. So it is just that forget. And it's interesting now that I was reading about the other day, we've gone from the concept of cancel culture to now uncancel culture, where people who have been cancelled are now reappearing again. And it's the rise of that again. So it's and we've moved on.
Yeah. For sure. Just a tiny short stay in cancel land, and then you've served and then you can come back. But yeah, it's the idea that these men are all multimillionaires and still have flourishing careers. But yeah, this is what it's landing on. Okay, so with that also as well, moving on, talking about racism and blackface in Europe. I'm going to do some terrible pronunciations right now. So this first one on top left is Zwarte Piet. Anyone wants to?
Zwarte Piet, yeah.
And so I do, obviously, again, I know that this is not to say that there is not people in these respective countries saying that this is wrong and incorrect. I'm not saying this is giant. The whole culture loves it and there's no one's problematizing it. These are just other examples that I found that are still happening, or people maybe still don't know about, or have happened before, and we don't think about the legacy of them. That's why I'm mentioning them. It's not to say that everybody in those countries supports it, nor do everybody in the UK support the blackface that happened. So yes, Zwarte Piet. And then these are, again, I'm going to ask Jessica to pronounce this one. Or maybe you don't want to say that word out loud, but so they're those chocolate, they're like marshmallows in a chocolate coating. And so it's like a snack. So I think we all know what that's trying to say. In French, they're also called tête de nègre. And so quite literally the consumption of black bodies and these again are images that are very reminiscent of sort of very minstrelly show representations of black folk. The bottom left is, where have I got that written down? I'm going to pronounce it really badly anyway, but it's in German it's Santa Claus's buddy, all right, or is he the bad guy?
Yeah, Knecht Ruprecht. Oh, sorry, Katrin, go ahead.
Yeah. I wanted to say it's again the blackface that you show in the upper left corner. They're actually the slaves of that guy that stands in the middle in the bottom picture, in the tradition of the Netherlands and Belgium and maybe also Germany. And the guy in the middle is called Sinterklaas or Santa Claus. And but he's not the same as the Santa Claus with the elves that comes at Christmas. So we celebrate this in the beginning of December. But so that guy doesn't have elves to be his slaves and make toys, but he's got these black faces. Anyway, horrible story.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing.
And it is heavily debated, both in the Netherlands and in Belgium, by many people. But also ridiculed by politicians, like the picture on the top right, the negerkussen. So it's a Negro kiss, that thing. It was a picture of that sweet chocolate thing was posted by one of our ministers just a couple of weeks ago, and with a question like, how silly it is that they want us to change these names. You know, so she was ridiculing us, calling out, you know, these horrible things. And she's a minister. It's a very interesting story because she's a minister of a very conservative right-wing party, but she herself has a Moroccan migrant background. And so she's kind of like, you know, a person who's used by that party as an excuse to claim that they are no racists, because how could they be racist when they have this minister, you know, with a migrant background? And it's really horrible. It gets entangled and it's multi-layered and it's complex and it's really bad, but it's very much alive, that those types of racism in Belgium.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine, for sharing that. And I think that last point that you made, which brings me to the bottom right, which is by an artist called Mankot Lind in Sweden. My Swedish is terrible, so that's why that was really bad. And so he is a Black artist who created this art exhibition work. And so this is actually, oh no, sorry. There we go. So this is actually a real man's head. And then the bottom, so then on the picture, the bottom part is like a cake. And so this woman here is the Swedish Minister of Culture, and she's feeding the cake to the rat. So there's a man's head under the table, and then there's a cake body with like with extremely exaggerated kind of black features, very, very natural dark black skin. And so the man who created this is also a Black man. He is, again, what you would call mixed race, biracial. But the idea that reason why I wanted to bring this in, which also just links to the point again that Catherine made, is the idea that he has kind of said in interviews, like, he's struggling with issues to do with his identity. You know, for Black folks, I'm seen as white. For white folks, I'm seen as Black. And this idea that either being a Black person or being of mixed heritage, the idea that you are completely knowledgeable about your entire history and the impact that that has on you, and you're able to articulate it and process it in a very healthy way that doesn't come out. So again, the idea that this was created by a Black man gives it permission for it to exist almost. And so in a very similar way in which I think that people politically are often used when they come from like minoritized backgrounds, or they have kind of different relatives, or they're mixing circles with different minoritized groups, the ways in which that's often used as, well, this person said it's okay, so therefore it's okay. And I use this one particularly because this is obviously a way in which I want us to talk about and think about the idea that just because you are a minoritized individual, which is why I said specifically this session is directed towards white folk to think about this, that you have the knowledge and the understanding and the ability to process the oppression that you've been put through. We're throwing that off the table. I will talk about that a little bit later, but I just wanted to reference that picture properly. Yes, another one here again. So top left is the famous Carnival in Italy, in Viareggio. And so you'll often see there, again, lots of people dressed as Native Americans. You'll see some blackface. You'll see lots of people dressed as Mexicans there as well. I was there like 2019. So yeah, again, still very recently happening. And then this is one of kind of the main prominent things that they use. They'll use ethnic minorities as a spectacle, again, as a costume. The middle one is a fancy dress party. These are French people. It's from a page called Mais non, c'est pas raciste. And so again, another thing here, a woman apparently dressed up as a Rastafarian. The right side is, again, Chinese and African makeup. Luis from Menengage actually sent me this one. So this was, I think, taken down last year in Sweden. This was still being sold somewhere and it was taken down. And then the bottom right, which again, as I said at the beginning, these are from a place in Belgium called Antwerp. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Catherine. But the idea is that they come from a story about like a troll that lived under the bridge. And then if you didn't get what you wanted from the troll, he would cut off your hand. And so it comes from this kind of old fable. But then at the same time, if we're talking about Belgium, we have to talk about Belgium and their colonization of the Congo. And so again, if you don't know the history of Belgians in the Congo, the production of rubber, the punishment for not enough rubber production was to have your hand severed, or the hands of your children or relatives, and they would be displayed as a form of, as an achievement, I guess, for the people that did it. So I'm not saying that these hands represent what happened in the Congo. They do come from a different story, but I just want to reference it because that is very, very intertwined. And I think that it's very difficult to separate the two. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Katrine.
Yeah, I have to say I live in Antwerp. I grew up in Antwerp, and people in Antwerp are very much aware that the hand is related to the story of, it was not a troll, it was a giant. A giant, yeah, and they cut off the hand of the giant. So we do not associate that with the cutting of the hands in the Congo. And that itself is horrible, because it means the story of the cutting of the hands in the Congo is not told in our schools to our children. And it's, one of the most horrible things, I think, of our own history, that we refuse to teach children about this. So even my children didn't get it in their school, and I was the one who had to tell them that horrible story. It has gruesome details what we did in the Belgian Congo. And it's yeah, and the worst part is that people wouldn't associate these hands with the Congo because they don't even know what happened in the Congo. That makes it even worse. And so they just associate it with the story of the giant, which that is where it does come from. But there isn't even a risk that anybody would associate it with the wrong cutting of hands, because people don't know the story of what happened in the Congo. Let alone that they would excuse themselves for this. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much for adding some clarity there. Really, really important, and I appreciate your input. So yeah, these are just a range of examples that, again, were pretty Googleable, and understanding, and I asked some other people to feed in. I know, Jessica, you helped with this as well, so thank you for that. So again, this is not to accuse entire countries of this. It's just to say that there are long-lasting legacies. And so what we talked about at the beginning of this session about these histories of enslavement and colonization, and the idea that they're in the past, is not true, because there are really lasting legacies of them today, not only in the rhetoric that we use in the discourses around us, the power structures, but quite literally representative in our lives and in the things that we consume. And there were also other things I could have used as well, like Uncle Ben's rice. There's a little like things from France where they still have like blackface, very like Aunt Jemima vibes on them. There are too many to put in this presentation, basically. But these are kind of some of the ones that stuck out to me the most. So why are we doing all of this? Why are we talking about this? We're centering it back in Europe. We're thinking about the role of racism in Europe, and then thinking about that and how that's going to contribute to our anti-racist work. And so I'm going to put you back in breakout rooms to ask you a question. Can we do pairs, Jessica? Because a couple people have joined.
Yes, we can do that.
I'm going to put you in pairs, and you'll have 1 minute each to answer this question. How am I not a racist? You're in breakout rooms for obvious reasons. The breakout rooms will be recorded. Yes, so you have 1 minute, listen to the other person, then 1 minute signal will come, and then the other person speaks, and then we'll come back in here together.
Too late to make it 3 hours.
Oh, let's go.
It's definitely too late for that one. No.
Yeah. No, don't worry. So, how am I not racist? If anyone genuinely wants to share, like we said, this is being recorded. So you just, so that everyone's aware. If you don't want to share, then that's fine. Catherine?
Yeah, what we were discussing, an important thing about being not racist is to be an active not racist person, and not just think, I'm not a racist, so it's not my problem. That's I think that is precisely the problem, that too many people think about themselves, I'm not a racist, so it's not my problem to solve. No, it is your problem to solve. If you're not a racist, then show it. Be an active non-racist person. Speak out when you see something happening and do something about it. And it's really wrong to think that racism should be solved by people of color, or just as much as it's wrong to think that sexism should be solved by women. No, men have to stand up and take an active role in fighting this. So this is how I try to be a not racist, by being active about it and outspoken.
Thank you for sharing. Does anyone else want to share?
I think in our space, we immediately came down to the distinction between being not racist and being anti-racist, and then for us being different things, and also being impossible to like remove oneself from that word. In the sense of, certainly for me, I couldn't say I am not racist or associated with based upon like looking at my own action, thinking, have I done enough to dismantle, to disrupt? And the answer to that will always be no. Like it will never arrive at a yes. So it's hard to remove myself from that and just thinking, well, I'm not racist because don't go around spouting, vitriolic bullshit. So yeah, it's impossible to disassociate from the word, having enjoyed the privileges of not having had to go through it. But equally, it's like, yeah, the distinction then between not being racist and being anti-racist for us. Anyway, I don't really know what my point is, but that we're just sharing.
Like you made a point there,
Yeah.
It was good. You elaborated on your first point, which I think was it. And so yeah, this idea of being anti-racist, which I did share a quote about at the beginning. I will share it again at the end about really what it means to be anti-racist. That's obviously why we're here, to commit to our anti-racism work. So I asked this question, I always ask this question in these types of sessions, because I think it's an important step to get across, particularly definitely for white folk, and really thinking about their anti-racism work, because this idea that the mere accusation of racism is more offensive than racism in and of itself is usually something that rings true for lots of people. And then again, the idea that quite literally everybody lives in a racist society. How can we possibly claim to be free of that in every single aspect of our lives? And so, for every single individual that lives in a racist society, you are impacted by racism. It is internalized somewhere there. That is not to say that you are actively going around and pursuing it. That does not say you're not paying attention to it. But the idea that you can be claimed to be free of 400 years of something, I mean, again, show me how you did it, really, because that's a big achievement. The idea, and so it's that initial acknowledgement that how can we ever claim, whether we're talking about sexism, whether we're talking about racism, all of these spaces of oppression, the idea that we can claim to be 100% free of them when it's all we've ever lived under, it's all we've ever known, is an absolutely giant claim. And so that isn't also to be like, oh, well, then everybody's racist. What's the problem? Don't misinterpret it there either. But it's this idea that some people can claim to have the power to resist what is an enormously powerful and oppressive force and ideology that sits over us and dictates the way that we interact and view one another, is absolutely huge. And that's the point of me asking this question, is the idea then at that point is that everybody needs to lean in completely different ways and to completely different capacities. Yes, but I do think that there are ways in which everybody should be leaning in here. With that in mind, we're going to move on and talk about anti-Blackness. The whole point of talking about anti-racism is crucial, is important. But what I really want to focus on, and I want to focus on particularly in this session, is understanding anti-Blackness. And anti-Blackness is usually what not usually gets left out of the conversation, but is often left out of the conversation in a conversation on racism. Racism is a very umbrella-like term for talking about the experiences of lots of marginalized folk. But fundamentally, for me personally and professionally, and in the work I have done, anti-Blackness is the one thing that sits at the root of so many of these issues and sits at the core and is at the bottom for everybody. And so if we're talking about hierarchizing people's experiences, realistically, what you find at the center of lots of cultures is the fact that anti-Blackness sits at the root of it. So we need to define that. We need to define what anti-Blackness is. I have had a go. This is my interpretation of what the things I have worked with and studied so far. So the hatred, disgust, fear, disregard, murderous envy, fetishization of racialized Black people. And I think I really want to talk about the role that anti-Blackness has as well, and as for us to think about the role that it plays and how it's very purposeful in terms of upholding systems of white supremacy and understandings of whiteness. And so anti-Blackness and Blackness fundamentally is used to reinforce whiteness. So it's this kind of, and it's quite a mouthy term, but co-constitutional identity formation. So the idea that I know I'm this because you're that. And we have to look at the ways throughout history whiteness has been shaped largely through the shaping of Blackness and thus then anti-Blackness. So the idea is that you can put yourself in proximity to Blackness as a way to measure your own humanness. The idea that Black people, Blackness is a process of dehumanization, and therefore whiteness feeds off it as a process of showing its own humanness and its own beauty and its own importance and its own power. They're consistently put together. They're consistently held in proximity to one another. I can go on for this for quite a while, to be honest. Does anyone have any initial questions? Okay. So in thinking about anti-Blackness, and thinking about our understandings of anti-Blackness, in terms of thinking about this dehumanization process that goes on when we're talking about it, I want to also think about the impact of it. So again, if we're talking about racism, we're talking about anti-Blackness as well. Therefore, the idea that when we're talking about racism and anti-Blackness is something that sits at the heart of our societies, that sits at the foundations of our cultures. What's the impact of that? And so I've put together a list of things, and I want you to just read them. Maybe take a minute, 2 minutes to just read them. And then what I would like you to do is just offer some reflections, feelings mostly, about the next slide. Any questions? Are we good? Okay. So I intentionally use different fonts, like sizes, bold, underline, because it's like difficult to read, maybe annoying to read, unsettling to read, as a teeny tiny insight into what it means to live with anti-Blackness as a Black person, what it means to deal with that. And so the list of all of these things here are examples of the consequences and the impact of anti-Blackness on an individual or group of people. And the reason why I list this here is because I think often, again, as we talked about before, different words are used, different terms are used. Racism is used as an umbrella term, but there are specific real structural consequences to anti-Blackness and the effect that they're having on Black folk, not only in the past, but today, in a very real sense. And I want you to use this list to think about what it means, first of all, to be able to be confronted with this list, to sit with that list in front of you, but also what it means to be a person that experiences, a Black person that experiences anti-Blackness, who aren't given the tools to understand it, that don't get access to a mainstream narrative that talks about or legitimizes their experiences, that in fact works to deny those experiences and to silence them. What it means to live with all of this inside of you and know that there's no way out. There's no way to go. Someone said to me once, "What's the least racist country in the world?" I was like, I don't know. I don't know where to go. I don't know where to find that place. And to know that and potentially all of these things, some of these things, a percentage of these things are happening to you. No one's teaching you how to articulate them, how to get it out, how to counteract it. You have no personal power whatsoever to stop them. And essentially to just have to accept that and what that really means. So this is purposefully put together. It's meant to be quite shocking, but I really want to open a space to think about what it means to live with these things each and every day, with no indication of when that's going to go away and when that's ever going to stop. Even if you'll outlive it, the idea that that's probably not going to happen. You don't have to give any answers. I'm not asking questions. These are just reflection points. If anyone would like to make any reflections or comments, you're welcome to. If not, we can move on.
Something I'm thinking about reading all of this, which I'm sure is not an exhaustive list, but like the fact that, I'm assuming you, KCB, sat down and listed this out, and then just linking it to that last line there of like poor schooling, or more broadly, like lack of access to educational spaces. Like, I can imagine that the experience of having all this inside, yet not even being able to name it or label it or recognize that is it going on, is even heavier. as well, like adding to that. So that sits quite heavy in my shoes, I would say.
Thanks for sharing, Mitchell.
Yeah, I can share something if you want.
Sure, you can, Nat. You're a bit
Sure,
quiet.
yeah. Oh, really? Okay. What about now? If I just get closer to them.
Yeah, just get really close.
Get really close. Okay, yeah. So I think a lot of this stuff, you know, I live in London, and a lot of the stuff you'll see, you will see sometimes quite a lot of, well, you see a lot of men in general, but certainly a lot of black men in London who are homeless and will be quite often like shouting and screaming quite aggressive things. And I remember once getting on the bus, and there was someone, an older homeless black man, shouting and screaming a lot of really unpleasant stuff. And I went to the back of the bus and just sat opposite him, and I would watch as everyone else would come up and like immediately go back downstairs. So it's literally just me and this man at the top of the bus. And it just, yeah, I don't know. It made me think, all of this stuff made me think of that man. And I actually ended up getting to know him later, because afterwards I ended up in contact with him at a homeless shelter. But it just reminded me of that stuff, because I think the reason why perhaps I was comfortable sitting close to that person is because I am just aware that, or perhaps more aware than some other people, that people live with this. And so I wasn't really scared, despite the sort of stuff he was saying, because it's just, for me, a lot of, like, when I see people act like that, a lot of it, for me, it just feels like, well, that's kind of the natural conclusion to what these people are going through. You know, that level of anger and that level of discombobulation and confusion. But yeah, that's what it made me think of. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Nat, for sharing a personal story as well. I really appreciate that. But yeah, I definitely can say I relate. And as you say, the idea that when you do see certain individuals, you said, who really have kind of reached quite desperate points in their lives, but you're like, can't even blame you, mate. Do you know what I mean? Like those spaces exist in my head as well. But like, have I had the circumstances and the privileges in certain ways that means I don't end up like that? Maybe yes. Also, another, I remember as well in London when I was studying, there was a homeless man who was black, and he was following me, and he was shouting at me and screaming and saying gross things. And I just kept saying, sorry, excuse me, can you leave me alone? Like, I don't have anything. Like, can you just stop coming so close to me? And the way in which everybody looked at us, like, look at them. And then I ended up running into a shop, and I was crying because he was running, he kept like shuffling in his pockets. I thought he was going to pull like something, like he was going to try and pull a knife at me or something. I don't know what it was, but I was just terrified, and everyone was just staring. And this is like that main street in London, like where all the theatres are, like very public place as well, like very central. And he chased me into Superdrug, and he had me up against the wall and was shouting at me. And everyone just stood and watched. And then another black guy who worked there came over and was like, dude, come on, like, leave her alone. And he just sort of muttered under his breath and walked away. And I was crying, and I looked over to the woman at the till, and there was a white woman and a white couple stood there. And I was crying, and I was like, why didn't you help me? And again, like, this man was visibly homeless. Like, you could see that his clothes were worn and they were stained. And they turned to me and they said, oh, we thought you were together.
Oh.
And I was like, okay, cool, like, bye. And so like that's it. Like, that was it. That's this representation of Liz, like the ways in which that, like, we're from this whole very, like, tolerant, accepting society, and the idea, but like that they would put us together. But then even as well, on top of that, the idea that we were together, but also even if we were together, that man was attacking me and like abusing me, and that was just still okay. Like, oh, it's just them and what they do. And it's in like those tiny pockets of moments as well where you really start to see, like, and feel how this is happening in such a real active way. But yes, I rarely share stories. I shared a story. There you go.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to say anything? That's going to be fun. Okay, so another question, which is, when confronting issues relating to race/racism, what do we expect of Black people and non-Black people of color? Maybe do 2 breakout rooms? Do you want to do pairs, or how do you want to do it? I mean, there's not loads of you, but In pairs. Okay. Pairs again. Yeah, I'll give you like 2 or 3 minutes. Hello.
Hi.
How is that? Does anyone want to share? I have a list, if not.
Yeah, sure.
Thanks, Dan.
I thought, well, yeah, I don't know if other people put their hand up, like polite, well-mannered people do. Sorry. We had a discussion, and I think obviously, so I was with Nate, and I think we're coming from different positions there, and we actually had very, very, very different responses to this question. Do you mind me saying your response, Nate, or do you want to?
Yeah, no, go ahead. I said, well, yeah, okay. Then my response: the only thing I would actually expect a black or non-black person of color to behave when confronted with racism is just I would only expect a feeling, and that would just be it. Like usually of sadness or anger. Yeah.
Whereas I reflected on how I've expected people to be in the past, or what I've been taught to expect people to be, or what I still sometimes expect people to be, which is, to come forward with something very rational, to have explained it to me, to educate me, to have dealt with their emotions so they're not too angry, to have almost like presented a business case. So if there's anything to be corrected or changed, it can be done very quickly and very easily. And I think, in short, I came out saying, like, I just expect all the work to be done by black people and non-black people of color around racism before it gets to me, all the processing work. And obviously that's what I'm precisely trying not to do. And I think that's, the reasons why I'm in workshops like this. But like, I felt that's also probably a much broader requirement that sits there in society of people. Like, don't riot, don't be so angry, don't do all these things. Forgive us, have a bit of compassion for the poor white people who are trying really hard. That type of thing. Anyway, that was our really, really different answers to that question.
Thank you both for sharing and for giving us 2 very different insights there as well. Yeah, I think, Dan, I think you hit the nail on the head there with the expectations of black and non-black people of color when we're talking about race and racism. Things I'd written down were like respect, kindness, patience, comfortability, time, willingness, enthusiasm, gratefulness. Often the idea that we should be grateful for the spaces that we're given to talk about our oppression. And I know that, I don't know if you follow her, Klitschko calls herself the ungrateful black woman, which I like to adopt on myself sometimes. The idea that, no, I'm not grateful to talk about these spaces and what that really means. And often as well, when we're having these conversations, what does it mean to have those expectations of black people when we're doing this, because this is apparently the only way we can do the work. We can only get it done. We can't go too much. We can't come in hard. We have to leave the emotion out of it. Like, it's not their fault. It's their problem. Then we have to make sure that it's clear. And then again, at the beginning, I talked a lot about using statistics and intellectualizing racism, that we have to have all the data there, and we have to make sure that everything's correct and right, because, God forbid, we just lean in with our feelings and make it up. And that's the reason why people should listen. And so again, thinking about how that's a tool of control and a tool of power and a tool of manipulation to make sure that these issues aren't being confronted whatsoever. Because if people are still bound by the expectations of a white supremacist society, then we're not doing any work whatsoever. So yeah, wasn't necessarily to say that that's your individual expectations of those people, but to really think about, when we see this enter into the discourse, what do we really expect? This is also my point of when I talked about at the beginning of the session, that this session was created with white people in mind, because there are different needs that need to be met in these spaces, and there's different work that needs to be done, and I don't want to put that labor on black people and non-black people of color. And so I think that's also the reason why I'm so explicit with this as well, because I think that that message often gets left out and gets thought about, the idea that, you know, even if this was a shared space, which I often don't advocate for, the idea that if somebody was to say something offensive, something rude, something horrible, is 100% not my job to silence that person in that moment. If they want to scream and shout and swear as much as they want, you go ahead, because racism is violence. And so if that gets met back with violence, that's not my job to control that. And so I think that it's really important as well, especially in the work that we're doing, if we're doing work on gender and sexism, to really be conscious of the spaces that we're opening and holding up, and the expectations that we have. They will be different based on how people have been racialized in those spaces. And so to be as conscious of that as possible, because a lot of it will sit right back here. Okay, so we're kind of at the end. I know we started a little bit late, but we had less people, so we've kind of come to the end anyway. I wanted to add this in. I'm reading this book at the moment. It's called Exterminate All the Brutes. And this quote was very impactful for me. And so I decided to add it in. And so there's actually also a TV series of this that's just come out by Raoul Peck. Obviously, I would recommend that you read the book first, but anyway. And so the quote is, "You already know enough. So do I. It is not knowledge we lack. What's missing is the courage to understand what we know and to draw conclusions." Which maybe does a disservice to me as a facilitator, that you don't need any more knowledge from me. But the idea is that we've been here and we've been learning together, and there's been lots of information and lots of shared learning moments. But the idea is that realistic, when we're talking about racism, we're talking about being anti-racist, when we're talking about eliminating all forms of anti-Blackness, we already know enough. Well, everybody knows enough. There's always more, as Toni Morrison said, there's always one more thing. There's always one more thing that you think you can learn and you know, and people put pause on because they think, well, I don't know enough of that. People say to me, well, I don't stop people when they say things, or I don't interrupt because I don't know enough, and I don't know the facts, and I don't know the stats. And I said, but you have feelings. You feel, you know that that's wrong, and you know that systemic racism is real, and the inequality is real, and the exclusion is real, and that people are dying because of those things. You know all of that. Well, what more do we need to know to do something about it? And so when I read this, I was like, wow, okay, this is really it for me in terms of what this anti-racism learning journey is about for so many other people. Also for myself, my own anti-racism journey. And so I wanted to share it here. No real conclusions to draw from it. I just think it's quite a powerful quote to share from that book. And so we'll end again with this, as we started, that the beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself, and it's the only way forward. And that is the end.
Thank you so much, Casey. I don't know if we have some last comments from the audience. No?
Just thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was really good.
Great. Yes, thank you so much, Casey, for this workshop, for this really, again, really thought-provoking conversation. And I really look forward to continue this conversation. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the next session will be with Tonya Lovelace, with Casey together, and it will be named Commitment and Investment, the Road Ahead. And I don't know if you want to say a few sentences to it, or...
Do you want to go? You want to say something first?
Sure, yes. Excuse me, you all. I'm been intermittently dealing with something with my throat here, but yes, we will converge a lot of these concepts into one session. We'll go to the next level of conversation. This will be much more work around your commitment and your investment in this. You'll hear more from Casey and I in a different context. And commitment is, it's going to be critical. We're actually looking at the time frame. I am saying out loud now that I'm not sure the 2 hours will be enough for what we want to do. So we may be asking for a 3-hour block. Our anticipation is that we have enough time. There's enough time now for that full time to be blocked. And so we will be putting the word out. But the intention is that you do as you did today, that you come, you bring your whole self. And I know Casey and I will. And Casey, do you have any other thoughts?
No, I just think that obviously, to reiterate everything you said, and that this has been a very personal thing for me as well. This all started off with my introduction to Men Engage and the work that I felt wasn't being done. And so not only did I bring my professionalism and my professional work, but I also bring a very personal journey here. And I think that that's important. I think that this has been particularly emotional for me, Tonya, and Jessica, as 3 minoritized women. Doing this work doesn't make it any easier. And so just to keep that in mind in the session, I think that's more than evident. I don't try and hide my feelings when I do this work, but that's the work that we want to keep doing, is that people lean in with their feelings. So yeah, just thanks everyone for coming, and please do spread the word to other people too, because we really want to make this work.
Yes, thank you everyone. So the session will be on 11 June from 2 to 4 Central European Summer Time, and I will send out a reminder again, and I also sent the registration link in this chat. Great. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks.
Thank you everyone.
Thanks everyone.
So much, guys.
Bye.